Somewhere inside that chamber is something almost no living person has ever seen with their own eyes. We'll get back there. But first, you need to understand why almost nobody who could walk up to it ever does. There is a forest in Madagascar that does not look like a forest at all. From above, it looks like the surface of a planet that has been split open and frozen mid-explosion. Thousands of stone blades, gray and razor-thin, rise out of the earth like something tore through the ground from underneath and never finished coming out. And the strange part isn't how it looks. The strange part is who refuses to go inside it. Not tourists. Not foreigners who don't know any better. The people who were born 20 minutes from its edge. The people whose grandparents lived their whole lives within sight of it. Ask them to walk past a certain line in the rock, and the answer doesn't change depending on how much you offer to pay them. They simply say no. And once you understand why, the story of this place stops being about a forest at all. It becomes a story about fear, about ancestors, about a country that lost almost everything it once had. And one place that survived precisely because everyone was too afraid to touch it. So here's the real question worth asking before anything else. What is actually inside this forest that an entire population has agreed, without writing it down anywhere, to leave alone? To answer that, we have to start with the island itself. And this part matters. Almost everything you think you know about Madagascar is probably built on a cartoon. Madagascar split away from the African mainland somewhere around 160 million years ago. And then, just to make sure the separation was permanent, it broke away from India roughly 90 million years ago as well. From that point on, it drifted alone in the Indian Ocean, cut off from every other landmass on Earth for tens of millions of years. And whatever life happened to be on board when that split occurred just kept evolving. Alone, with no new arrivals and no way out. That's the part most people skip past too fast. 90 million years of isolation doesn't just create a few unusual animals. It creates an entire alternate version of evolution. Around 90% of everything alive on Madagascar today, plants, mammals, reptiles, insects, exists nowhere else on the planet. Not rare elsewhere, not uncommon elsewhere. Nowhere else. If it dies out here, it is gone from the earth completely, in every sense of the word. Lemurs are the most famous result of that isolation, and people assume they understand lemurs because they've seen one in an animation made for children. But there are more than 100 different species of lemur on this island, ranging from something the size of a mouse to a creature that, before humans arrived roughly 2,000 years ago, stood close to the size of a gorilla. That giant version is extinct now, hunted out fairly quickly once people figured out it didn't run very fast. And that detail right there is the first thread of the real story. Because the moment humans arrived on Madagascar, the relationship between people and the wild here became complicated, and it has stayed complicated ever since. But while most of the island's original forest has paid the price for that complicated relationship, and we'll get to exactly how much was lost, because the number is brutal. There is one region on the west coast that tells a completely different story. A region where the trees are still standing, where rare animals that exist nowhere else still move freely between the stone, and where almost no one outside a small circle of trained guides has ever set foot. It's called the Chingi. The word itself is a warning. In the local Malagasy language, Chingi roughly translates to the place where you cannot walk barefoot. Not a metaphor. A literal, practical warning passed down for generations, because the ground here is built from limestone that has spent millions of years being dissolved, carved, and sharpened by rainwater until what's left isn't really rock anymore. It's blades. Endless rows of vertical stone blades, some taller than a 4-story building, packed together so tightly in places that a person has to turn sideways just to pass between two of them. Now picture actually standing at the edge of it for the first time, not watching a drone shot of it. Standing there, at ground level, with the sun already starting to climb and the heat pressing down on the back of your neck. The first instinct almost everyone has is to reach out and touch the nearest spike, because from a distance it looks almost soft, like coral, like something you could run your palm across. You can't. The edges are sharp enough to open skin in less than a second, and locals will tell you, with a completely straight face, that they have seen what's left of a boot after a single bad step. It isn't a clean cut, it's a shredded mess, and that's just the surface. Underneath the blades, the ground isn't solid either. There are crevices that drop straight down into total darkness, some only a few meters deep, others connecting to entire cave systems that haven't been fully mapped. Step wrong, and you're not falling onto rock. You're falling into a gap between rocks that might not have a visible bottom from where you're standing. This is, by almost any practical measure, one of the most dangerous walkable landscapes on Earth. And it is also, somehow, full of life that exists almost nowhere else. Deccan's Sifaka, a lemur with a face like it's permanently startled and a leap that can clear gaps between rock towers most humans wouldn't attempt with a rope, moves through this terrain like it was custom built for them, because in a sense, it was. White-footed sportive lemurs nest in the hollows, and somewhere in the deep crevices and underground rivers that cut beneath the stone, there are Nile crocodiles, the same species you'd expect to find basking on a riverbank in the open sun, except these have adapted to live almost entirely in darkness, hunting through flooded cave tunnels where no light reaches at all. Picture that for a second. A crocodile in total darkness beneath a forest made of stone knives. That alone should be enough reason for caution. Now imagine you're the one crouched at the mouth of one of those crevices, headlamp on, rope already clipped to the harness on your back because the guide insisted on it before you'd even finished your coffee that morning. The opening is barely wide enough for your shoulders. Cold air pushes up out of the dark, carrying a smell of wet stone and something faintly mineral, almost metallic. You lower one boot in, find a ledge you can't see, and trust it anyway, because the only other option is climbing back out and never knowing what was actually down there. Somewhere below you, water is moving. You can hear it before your eyes adjust enough to see anything at all. That's not a special effect added for the camera. That's what the guides do here, regularly, as part of an ordinary working day. But here's the detail that actually keeps people out, and it has almost nothing to do with sharp rocks or hidden predators. There's a hierarchy of fear here, and the physical danger is only the entry-level version of it. Local guides, the ones who have spent decades learning every safe path through this stone maze well enough to bring tourists through it without losing them, will walk you right up to a particular boundary. A particular gorge, a particular ridgeline, a particular gap in the formations. And then they stop. Not because the path becomes more dangerous past that point. In some cases, it doesn't. The trail keeps going. The rock looks the same, but the guide will not take another step forward. And if you push, the answer you get isn't nervous or apologetic. It's firm, final. The kind of no that isn't up for negotiation regardless of money, regardless of curiosity, regardless of anything you say next. Because past that line, according to belief that runs deeper than most outsiders realize, you're no longer just walking through dangerous terrain. You're walking into land that belongs to someone else. To understand who, we need to talk about a word that shapes daily life across almost the entire island. A word most visitors have never heard before they land here, and one that explains more about Madagascar than any guidebook ever will. The word is Fady. Fady is best translated as taboo, but that translation flattens something that is much bigger in practice. A Fady isn't a rule written down by a government or a religion with a central authority. It's a living, local, often very specific restriction tied to a place, a family, a clan, or an event, And it's treated with the same seriousness most people reserve for laws that carry real legal punishment. Except the punishment for breaking a fady isn't a fine or a court date. It's believed to be misfortune, illness, death in the family, bad luck that follows you and the people connected to you for years. And fady attaches itself to forests more than almost anything else, because forests, in traditional Malagasy belief, are where the ancestors are. This is where the story stops being about geology and starts being about something much older and much more human. Across Madagascar, ancestor veneration isn't a side detail of culture. It is, in many regions, the actual center of it. The dead aren't treated as gone. They're treated as present, still involved, still watching, and still capable of helping or punishing the living depending on how they're treated. There's a famous ceremony here called Famadihana, sometimes translated as the turning of the bones, where families exhume the remains of ancestors years after burial, rewrap them in fresh silk shrouds, and carry them through the village in a celebration that looks, to an outsider, almost like a festival. Music, dancing, food, laughter. Except the guest of honor has been dead for years. It is not treated as morbid here. It is treated as one of the most important obligations a family has, a way of keeping the relationship between the living and the dead intact. And this is the connection that explains everything about the Forbidden Forest. Certain forests are believed to be the resting places of ancestors who matter even more than the average family member. Specifically, the Sakalava people of western Madagascar, the group whose ancestral territory includes the Chingi region, hold a belief that runs back centuries, that the spirits of the Vizimba still live within this land. The Vizimba are, depending on who you ask, either the legendary first human inhabitants of Madagascar or something closer to nature spirits that predate human settlement entirely, or both at once, layered together over generations until the line between history and spirit world stopped being something anyone needed to separate. What almost everyone agrees on is this: the Vizimba came first, and the Vizimba never fully left. And inside certain hidden chambers within the Chingi, sealed away in crevices that are nearly impossible to reach without serious climbing equipment, there are tombs. Royal tombs, according to Sakalava tradition, belonging to kings and queens who ruled this region long before any outsider arrived with a map or a name for any of it. These tombs are not marked with signs. They are not protected by fences or guards with weapons. They are protected by something that has worked for far longer than any fence could: the absolute conviction, shared by an entire community, that disturbing them invites consequences no amount of money is worth risking. That's the boundary the guides won't cross. Not a cliff edge, not a snake. A line drawn by respect for the dead that is held for generations, in a country where almost nothing else has been left untouched for that long. And once you understand that this single belief, repeated by a small population on the edge of one forest, has managed to do something that government conservation programs across the rest of the island have struggled for decades to achieve, keeping a piece of land completely intact, the story stops being a curiosity. It becomes one of the most quietly remarkable conservation stories on Earth, and almost nobody outside Madagascar has ever heard it. There's a guide in the region, a man local crews simply call Desi, who has spent close to 20 years leading people through the safe corridors of the Chingi. He grew up in a village near the park boundary, learned the rock the way some kids learn a bicycle, by falling on it repeatedly until his body figured out the balance on its own. Ask him how many times he's been frightened out on the stone, and he laughs, because the answer is constant. Every single trip, even after 2 decades. Ask him if he's ever gone past the boundary near the hidden tombs just to see what's there, just once, out of curiosity, and the laughing stops immediately. He says no, the same way you or I would answer if someone asked whether we'd ever walked into oncoming traffic on purpose. The question doesn't even register as something worth considering. That reaction is the part most visitors get completely wrong before they arrive. They assume the fatty is a performance, something locals mention for atmosphere, the kind of thing a guide says because tourists enjoy a spooky detail. It is not that. The single biggest mistake people make here is treating a sacred boundary like a photo opportunity, pushing a guide to go just a little further for a better shot, assuming the rules bend the way rules tend to bend everywhere else once enough money is on the table. Here, they don't. And the fastest way to lose a guide's trust completely, sometimes permanently, is to keep asking after the first no. What makes this even more striking is what it has produced almost by accident, because the Sakalava were never trying to run a conservation program. Nobody sat down decades ago and designed a management plan to protect endemic lemur habitat using ancestor worship as the enforcement mechanism. It simply happened that way. Fear and respect doing quietly what regulation alone has struggled to do everywhere else on this island. And once you see how much has been lost everywhere else, that becomes the part of this story that's almost hard to believe. The number is 90%. Not 90% of one species. Not 90% of a single forest type in a particular corner of the island. 90% of the original forest cover that was standing across Madagascar when humans first arrived 2,000 years ago. Gone. Cleared, burned, converted into agricultural land that in many cases stopped being productive within a generation because the soil underneath, so entirely dependent on the root systems and the shade and the leaf fall of the forest above it, broke down almost immediately once that cover was removed. It wasn't just the trees that left. It was everything the trees were holding together, and once that started, it didn't stop. What makes the number even harder to sit with is the timeline. It didn't disappear steadily, across centuries, in a way that other systems could compensate for. A massive portion of it came down in the last 60 years. The most severe losses happened in the last 30. You can find satellite imagery from the mid-20th century and compare it side by side with images from today, and the difference is not subtle. It looks like someone made an error somewhere and applied a burn filter to 90% of a country and forgot to undo it. Green becomes pale orange. Orange becomes brown. The rivers that ran clear in the older images run deep red in the newer ones because the topsoil, having nothing left to anchor it, slides off the hillsides and carries itself into the water and eventually out to sea in plumes visible from orbit. The Malagasy have a name for the color of those rivers. They call it the blood of Madagascar. Scientists who study erosion here call it some of the most severe documented topsoil loss on Earth. Those two descriptions come from completely different frameworks and arrive at exactly the same place. Now take that image, the stripped hillsides, the red water, the brown where green used to be, and put it next to the satellite view of the Chingi from the same altitude, the same angle, the same moment in time. From above, the Chingi is a dark gray mass surrounded entirely by the burnt colors of land that has been through the cycle of clearing and degradation and failed agriculture and erosion and collapse. The contrast is so stark that a person with no knowledge of the region, shown the image without labels, could trace the boundary of the formation with a finger from pure color difference alone. The gray is sharp and absolute against everything surrounding it. And the gray, from above, is intact. The reason is almost insultingly simple. The stone defeated every attempt at conversion by being what it was. You cannot burn limestone. You cannot plow vertical rock into crop rows. You cannot make charcoal from a material that is already several million years older than the concept of fire. The same blades that make the Chingi almost impossible to move through on foot make it entirely impossible to clear, to plant, to develop, to touch in any productive agricultural sense. The land simply said no to every kind of use that destroyed everywhere else, and it said it without any help at all. And inside that unconvertible land, something happened that nobody planned. The species that had been slowly losing ground across the rest of the island, pressured by habitat loss, by hunting, by the cascading effects that follow when you remove the ecosystem that everything else depends on, kept surviving here. Not surviving in the technical sense where a population is present, but fragile, held up by emergency intervention, one bad breeding season from disappearing. Surviving in a way that researchers who first began seriously studying the Chingi's ecology in the 1980s and 1990s described with a very specific kind of careful professional language that, if you know how to read it, tells you they were surprised. They used the word intact ecosystem, which, translated out of scientific reserve and into plain speech, means it works. The food chains connect. The species are there in the numbers they're supposed to be in. The whole mechanism functions the way it was functioning before humans arrived with an entirely different set of priorities. Deccan's sifaka, the white-bodied lemur whose method of moving through the vertical stone looks like something between parkour and flight, and pure arrogance about the concept of gravity, exists inside the Chingi in population numbers that researchers currently consider genuinely stable. Not recovering, not sustained by supplemental programs. Stable. In Madagascar conservation biology, stable is the word you almost never get to use. When you hear it, you pay attention. The mongoose lemur, reddish-brown, fast, moving between the limestone towers with the particular confidence of something that has been solving this specific obstacle course for long enough that the obstacles stopped registering as obstacles. Nests and forages in the crevices in numbers that would have been, 2 generations ago, completely ordinary for this island, but that now represent something worth cataloging. The white-footed sportive lemur, which does most of its activity after dark and spends the daylight hours sitting in the hollows of the rock in a posture that an outsider would describe without hesitation as meditative because it looks exactly like that, holds its position in the dark gaps between blades where almost nothing else can follow. And then there's the animal that doesn't fit the frame. The one that appears in field notes and published research papers and in the carefully worded accounts of people who have spent serious time inside the cave systems beneath the formation, and still, no matter how many times you encounter it, produces the same small cognitive jolt of wrongness. The sense that one category is being asked to contain something from a completely different category. The cave-adapted Nile crocodile. Crocodilus niloticus is one of the most recognizable animals on Earth. It is the crocodile of open water, of wide riverbanks, of basking spots where a full body length of animal lies so completely still in the sun that you question whether it's alive until the moment something changes nearby and it isn't still anymore. It is a creature built for light and warmth and space and accessible water. Nothing about its profile, its known behavior, its documented range suggests underground cave dweller, nothing at all. The population living beneath the Chingi changed that expectation so completely that when the first researchers began documenting it in the early 2000s, the papers they published moved through the herpetology community the way papers move when they contain something that the existing literature has no clean place for. These crocodiles, isolated in the flooded cave passages and underground rivers that thread through the rock below the surface formations, had been adapting to total darkness and confined spaces for long enough that the animals researchers found showed measurable physical differences from their open water relatives: paler coloration, different movement patterns, a hunting methodology that operates without the visual range that makes a surface crocodile effective in the way a surface crocodile is effective. Instead, they rely with unusual precision on the pressure-sensitive receptors embedded along their jawlines. The same system that detects the bow wave of something moving in the water nearby, the confirmation that something is there before any other sense can confirm it. They feel the dark before they move through it. Now consider the logistics of actually studying them. You are not standing on a riverbank with binoculars and a field notebook. You are in a wetsuit, in a flooded passage that in some sections narrows to the width of a residential hallway, with a headlamp casting a column of light that makes everything outside its beam more absolute rather than less, and a rope connected to a guide holding the other end at the surface entrance you passed through, however many minutes ago. And the animal you are trying to observe did not evolve in an environment that presented it with any meaningful threat from things that swim toward it through the dark, because nothing that has been down here with it has been a threat. It evolved, instead, to be the threat. Approaching it is not the same as approaching a surface crocodile on an open bank where it has room to leave and reasons to consider leaving. Down here, in the water, in its own absolute environment, it has neither of those things. The researchers who have done this describe the experience in language that reveals, underneath the scientific precision, a very specific kind of managed fear. Words like cautious approach appear often in the methodology sections. Deliberate, aware of position relative to the animal at all times. Not the language of people at ease. The language of people who are accounting for every variable they can see and maintaining a running estimate of the ones they can't. But here's what those researchers found when the work went further, and why it matters beyond being the most remarkable footnote this story has to offer. The cave crocodile population may not simply be a population that adapted. It may be in the early measurable stages of becoming something separate. Isolated long enough, in conditions different enough, the genetic divergence between these animals and their surface relatives has reached a point that researchers are still in the process of formally characterizing, which means the Chingue's underground ecosystem isn't only preserving what was already here, it may be producing what comes next. The early chapters of a new thing, written in darkness and total isolation, the way all new things in this part of the world seem to be written. This is the part of the story that conservation biologists who engage honestly with the Tsingy tend to get quiet about, because it forces a particular kind of reckoning. The usual framework for conservation involves identifying what exists, measuring how threatened it is, and designing interventions to keep the threatened thing from disappearing. It's a framework built around preservation, around holding a line against loss. The Tsingy suggests a different frame entirely. Not just hold the line, let the process continue. Because the process, given enough time and enough stability, doesn't just maintain, it generates. And that framework didn't come from a university department or an international conservation fund. It came, sideways and accidentally, from an ancestor veneration practice in a rural community on the west coast of an Indian Ocean island, maintained not by any organization but by a shared understanding that runs below the level of policy, below the level of written rule, below almost anything an outsider would recognize as a management system. In the 1990s and early 2000s, as researchers began publishing their findings about the Tsingy's ecological integrity and started asking serious questions about why that integrity had held while everything around it had not, the honest answers produced a phrase that started appearing in academic literature with increasing frequency: sacred groves. The concept wasn't new, exactly. Ethnobotanists had been documenting similar patterns in parts of West Africa and India for decades, but it hadn't been taken seriously as a mechanism, as an actual functioning tool by the mainstream conservation world. The Tsingy forced a reconsideration, because when you map sacred groves across Madagascar, areas where traditional belief, Fadi, ancestor connection, some form of spiritual restriction has kept human activity out, and then overlay those maps with satellite data showing remaining intact forest, the correlation is not subtle. It is not a mild trend. It is the kind of result that, in other fields, would be treated as primary rather than supplementary. The places that were protected by belief are, in a significant number of cases, the places that are still standing. This doesn't mean the knowledge held by rural Malagasy communities about the forest is always accurate in the sense that Western ecology would measure accuracy. It doesn't mean FADI is a transferable conservation policy that can be packaged and replicated in other contexts. What it means is simpler and harder to argue with. A community that treats a piece of land as genuinely sacred in a way that runs deep enough to override personal economic interest tends to leave that land alone in a way that no other mechanism has consistently achieved. And when the land is left alone long enough, something worth protecting tends to develop inside it. You understand all of this by the second day. You don't arrive at it purely through reading. You arrive at it through the rock. Because there is a specific quality to walking the safe corridors of the Qingji with a guide like Desi that isn't available through any description of it. The ropes and harnesses clip and unclip at regular intervals as the path crosses sections where the drop to one side goes further than a fall should go. The sun works differently in here than it does in open air. It arrives in angled columns between the blades rather than from above, so that the light seems to move horizontally rather than vertically, and the shadow lines are precise rather than gradual. The sound changes constantly. In wider sections, there's a resonance to your own footsteps, a return from the stone walls close enough on either side that you can hear the echo of your own movement half a second behind you. In narrow sections, the sound compresses, flattens. In gaps between formations where the wind catches a specific angle of blade at a specific speed, there's a tone, low and not quite steady, that sounds less like wind and more like the environment trying to communicate something specific without being specific about what. On the second morning, Desi stops at a place where the main path curves left and another corridor goes straight. The straight one descends slightly between two walls of rock that close in as they go deeper. At first, it looks like any of the other passages. Then your eyes adjust to the different quality of light ahead, and you see it. At the far end of the narrowing corridor, where it opens slightly before the stone closes around it again, there's an opening. Not a natural crevice. An opening that has, barely visible at this distance in this light, something around it that stone alone doesn't produce. Edges that are too deliberate. A shape that carries the particular quality of having been considered rather than formed. Stones placed rather than fallen. Something that is not geology. Desi doesn't explain what it is. He doesn't need to, because by now you already know what it is. You've known, in some sense, since the beginning of the story, since a chamber was mentioned and then deliberately set aside for later. Later is now. What's in there, according to everyone who has ever discussed it with the certainty of someone who has not been inside, is a tomb. Sakalava Royal. Old enough that the word old doesn't carry the full weight of what's meant. Sealed by stone and by darkness and by the particular quality of belief that doesn't need enforcement because it exists somewhere below the level of choice, in the place where certain things simply are not options, regardless of whatever argument you construct around them. The fatty protecting it is not a rule. It is something more like a gravitational fact of this place. The rock, the darkness, the danger, the crocodiles in the caves below, the lemurs moving through the formations above. They are all, in some sense, the same story as the tomb. They all exist here because of the same original decision, that something mattered enough to leave alone, and that leaving it alone was an expression of understanding rather than a sacrifice of opportunity. Desi turns back toward the main path without saying anything. The corridor behind you stays where it is. And as you follow him back through the stone, back toward the wider sections where the rope harness feels less necessary, and the light comes from above again, and the sound opens back out, you have the experience that this place seems to reliably produce in people who spend enough time in it. Not awe exactly, though there's awe in it. Something more like a readjustment, a recalibration of the size of things and the significance of time, and the particular human habit of assuming that understanding something is the same as being entitled to it. There is something almost no living person has ever seen with their own eyes, behind you now, in the dark. And the darkness, against every instinct that says darkness means nothing is happening, is where everything that matters in this story has been quietly happening all along. The blades catch the sun as the path opens. Somewhere above you, the Safaka leaps between towers in that impossible casual way and lands and doesn't look back.